All right, let's dive right into this explainer. When we think of the Mughal Empire, our minds usually jump straight to massive piles of wealth or breathtaking architecture, right? But building a multi-century empire from scratch? That requires a very specific, highly optimized blueprint. So let's look beyond the basic dates and battles and really unpack the exact mechanics of how this empire was actually built.
Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at a fractured subcontinent. Second, Babur's military tech disruption. Third, Sher Shah's bureaucratic blueprint. And finally, the Rajput-Mughal alliance.
Okay, part 1. A fractured subcontinent. Let's set the stage in the early 1500s.
To really understand the Mughal rise, we have to picture the game board they were playing on back then. It was incredibly culturally vibrant, but man, was it deeply, deeply divided politically. You had the Delhi Sultanate heavily weakening under the Lodi dynasty, these incredibly powerful Rajput confederacies at west, fragmented Deccan sultanates, and of course, the massive Vijayanagara Empire down south. This absolute political disunity created a huge power vacuum, literally the perfect opportunity for an external disruptor to swoop in.
Which brings us to Section 2, Babur's military tech disruption. Let's look at that technological edge.
So Babur, a Timurid prince, fully capitalizes on that fractured landscape in 1526 at the First Battle of Panipat. And I want you to think about this absolute David versus Goliath mismatch. Ibrahim Lodi commanded a staggering 100,000 troops and 1,000 war elephants. And Babur? He had only about 12,000 soldiers. But while the traditional Indian armies were still heavily relying on cavalry, Babur brought a massive, devastating disruption to the subcontinent: sophisticated gunpowder warfare. To survive being that insanely outnumbered, Babur pulled out two absolute game-changing innovations. The first was the Tulugma tactic. It's basically a highly mobile flanking maneuver he picked up from the Uzbeks. By dividing his army into these rapid, mobile flanking divisions, his tiny force could actually encircle and completely trap a numerically superior enemy from the rear.
And then, he pairs that maneuver with the Ottoman Rumi method. Get this. Using his renowned gunners, Babur lashed baggage carts together to create a fortified defensive line. It was essentially a semi-permanent gun platform planted right in the middle of the battlefield. From behind this protective wall, his forces fired matchlocks and cannons with devastating efficiency.
So you put those together and it's a completely devastating combo. The booming cannons literally terrified Lodi's war elephants. They actually panicked, turned around, and trampled their own troops. The main Afghan force was completely bottlenecked against Babur's defensive cart line, while those Tulugma flanks swept right in to trap them. It was brain and tech overcoming immense brawn, giving Babur a decisive victory, ending the Delhi Sultanate and officially planting the flag of the Mughal Empire.
All right, Section 3. Sher Shah's bureaucratic blueprint.
Okay, so here is a massive historical irony for you. The absolute greatest administrative framework the Mughals ever used wasn't even built by a Mughal. It was actually built by Sher Shah Suri, a rival who temporarily kicked them right off the throne. Sher Shah instituted a harsh but frankly brilliant principle, holding local landlords completely responsible for local crimes. And the result was astonishing. As the historian Abbas Khan Sherwani noted, an old woman could travel completely safely with a basket of gold jewelry right on her head. He literally converted highway robbers into protectors of the peace. And Sher Shah also transformed the messy, abstract idea of taxation into a tangible, optimized workflow. He didn't just guess what farmers owed. He went in and physically measured the land using a standard measuring rod called the Gaze Sikandari, classified the soil quality, and introduced written contracts. The state issued a pata detailing exactly what was owed, and the farmer physically signed a kabuliyat promising to pay. It was brilliant bureaucracy.
But he didn't stop at taxes. Sher Shah totally overhauled the chaotic mixed metal economy by introducing a brand new, standardized silver coin. And it weighed exactly 180 grains, period. Merchants across the entire continent could instantly trust it.
And here is why this matters to us today. This single 16th century optimization birthed the foundation of the currency you probably still know today as the rupee. It was so flawless that later Mughal emperors just adopted it wholesale. Heck, even the British East India Company maintained it as their standard all the way until 1835. That's some serious staying power.
Let's dive into our final piece of the puzzle. Section 4, the Rajput-Mughal alliance. Look,
You can have the biggest guns and the best tax system in the world. But if you want to rule a vast subcontinent, you absolutely need local allies. Emperor Akbar realized that a massive empire only survives through inclusive integration. So instead of draining his resources in endless grinding wars against the fierce Rajput warrior class, Akbar introduced Sul-e-Kul, which means universal peace. He forged alliances through diplomacy and marriage, replacing military subjugation with actual inclusion.
By offering them a real share of imperial power, the Mughals managed to turn their most formidable regional rivals into their most fiercely loyal commanders. Rajputs were integrated straight into the Mansabdari system, taking on massive military and administrative roles. And crucially, they got to keep their ancestral lands. They were completely exempted from forced conversions, and they maintained all their cultural traditions. It was a masterclass in decentralized control built on mutual respect.
When you track the timeline of Mughal diplomacy, the pattern is impossible to miss. You see exactly how the empire thrived on this inclusion and how it fractured the exact moment they abandoned it. Akbar initiated this integration, and his successors Jahangir and Shah Jahan smartly maintained it well into the 1650s. But in the late 1600s, Emperor Aurangzeb shifted to a strict, orthodox policy that totally stripped Rajput autonomy. This shift from cooperation to confrontation sparked massive regional resistance and directly triggered the empire's eventual devastating decline.
To wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a thought on how these lessons apply perfectly to the institutions and nations of today. Think about it. If the ultimate recipe for building a superpower relies on technological disruption, bureaucratic efficiency, and inclusive diplomacy, well, what happens to modern superpowers when they forget their own blueprints? The Mughals didn't just stumble into power, they engineered it. It's a powerful reminder that building a massive system is incredibly hard, but sustaining it, that requires never abandoning the very principles that built it in the first place.